Basically, as an aerobiologist, I'm mainly focused on airborne particles, biological particles that can trigger the allergy reaction. I guess that based on the statistics, probably some of you are allergic to pollen or fungal spores, so it could be interesting for you. It will not be so data filling study, I think, not so intellectually demanding as the previous one, where it had a lot of statistics. It will be much more plain, I guess. But when we look at the filters, for example, with materials that we collected from the atmosphere, we can find them a lot of course, inorganic particles of different shapes. But among them, you can also find the particles that are usually slightly bigger, but they are origin from some usually plants or fungi or even animals. And they are like pollen grains or fungal spores or bacteria, viruses. Their size is more or less from nanometers to more or less like 100 micrometers. But usually, in the case of the fungal spores and pollen grains, they are usually from few micrometers to like maybe 40 micrometers. So in the case when we compare it with the PM10, for example, or PM2.5, so somehow they are quite similar in size. And basically they behave quite similar when we think about the dispersion or transport in the atmosphere. So with these biological particles, somehow we also call biological air pollutants in comparison to chemical air pollutants. Maybe we can argue whether this can be could be called as pollutants. But when we look at some definition of pollutants, air pollutants, the pollen or spores, they fit quite well to this because they are like here, they are of course biological. They can, after exceeding some kind of threshold, they can cause allergy reaction, for example, or have some other adverse effect on our health. And also, I believe that right now what we have usually and mainly in the urban environment, the combination and concentration of pollen or spores it's really far from the natural characteristic, because somehow we human really affect what is in the air, and it is really far from the natural what should be in nature, especially in the urban environment. And I will be talking mainly about the inhaled allergens, so-called aeroallergens that can cause, as I said, allergy reaction. So when we, just very short introduction from biological point of view, when we look at the pollen grains, this is just the scan of the pollen. Pollen are just the carrier of the proteins of the allergens that can cause allergy reactions. So we can say that I'm for example allergic to birch pollen, but I should say that I'm allergic to specific proteins in the pollen. So the most important are proteins, and why they are important, because when the pollen, for example, is in the humid condition, or for example in the rainwater or mucosa, they start releasing the allergen from inside to the environment, and through the holes or through the microchannels, or just because of the osmotic shock, they can break up, and all this cytoplasmic content could be just released to the atmosphere. But very similar processes in our nose. When we inhale the pollen land on our mucosa. That is, of course, very like liquid, very humid. So then the proteins are released, and we have the allergy reaction. And the more pollen we have, the more allergen we have, and the more intense reaction. But important in the case of the proteins is that in the pollen or spores, we have different types of proteins, of course, as in every living cells, and the pollen is just have like 2-3 cells. And this usually we have several allergens. For example, in the birch pollen, we have like maybe six allergens. They are different proteins, have different function in the pollen. Some of them are major allergens, some of these are minor allergens. I'm, for example, probably I think I'm allergenic to PETFA1 because I have also cross-reactivity with hazel. I cannot eat hazel. I cannot eat apple just because I have cross-reactivity with this specific proteins. But it doesn't mean that some of you who is, for example, could be also allergenic to birch, but for other proteins and have the cross-reaction with different types of other pollen just because they are similar to BETFA2, for example. And also what is important that the concentration amount of these proteins in the pollen could be different, could vary from one pollen to another, from one species to another species. For example, there's a study from Germany when they compare different grass species, and we can see that the concentration of major P3 or P5 proteins could be like several times different in different grass. And the same also concern the different population of the same trees. For example, we in Poznan, we measure the concentration of major allergen of birch, BETFA1, and in different population, different stands in the city or forest or outside the city, the concentration of the proteins in the pollen could be like 10 times higher. So the question is, of course, why we have these differences, why the proteins differ in the context of quality and quantity also. And especially in urban environment, the most important factors, I would say, are the climatic factors and also the air pollution. They act as a stressor on the plants, and that's why as some of these proteins are like stressors proteins, they are overproduced when the plants is under stress. These proteins could be much higher than in the clean conditions. And for example, when we look at the temperature, there are some studies that showing that when the tree grow in the sunny area, they produce not only more pollen, but also the pollen that contain much more proteins. And this is also results in the higher response of our body, and the reaction are stronger just because we have more protein in this pollen. Also, there's the question of how the temperature or climatic condition affect the pollen itself when it's already released in the atmosphere. And right now, we during one project we try to estimate this effect. But when we because the temperature is one thing, another is the different kind of air pollutants that can affect the pollen and allergens. And I will just show you the results of the NO2 because this is mainly related to the urban area, related to transportation, and along the street usually we have a lot of plants, ornamental trees that are planted, and the NO2 should have quite high impact on them. So there are some studies, experimental studies that show that when, for example, pollen is fumigated with a high concentration of NO2, there are some changes that, especially in the membrane and the pollen wall, that it's weaker and start break, and the content of this pollen start release, and of course without that also the allergenic proteins. And the same situation was observed in the case of platanus, that is ornamental species that is very common in many countries. And they also noticed that there is some problems with the cell walls. Also, they noticed that the concentration of one of these proteins, allergenic proteins, is likely doubled. And this also have an impact on the EG recognition. So the individuals have stronger reaction to this particular pollen. It's not only probably related to the amount of the protein, but also some difference, some changes in the structure of these proteins, because The NO2 caused some nitration of specific amino acids, and probably the changes in the structure caused that our immune system slightly different react to this proteins. Also, this very similar situation was noticed with the Ambrosia rugby, which is very highly allergenic species, very invasive. It's from North America, but right now it's all over the world, also in Australia and Europe. And they also noticed that in the high concentration of NO2, the concentration of AMBA1, so the main allergen, increased. Hopefully, it's not always like that. Some specific proteins is decreasing when there is the NO2, so it's a good. But it looks like that it depends on the proteins because they have different function. It also depends on the plants, but when we take everything into account, it looks like that the ozone, the pollutants or affect usually in a bad way. I mean, the allergenicity will increase in the context of amount of proteins or some changes, and this is not really good impact on us. So yeah, we have these two types of particles. They affect our body, but also we have to remember that chemical pollutants affect the biological pollutants, and because of that, the consequences for our health is worse, unfortunately. And that's everything. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that interesting talk. Do we have questions from the audience? Or? Okay.
Thank you. So back to Melbourne. A few years ago, we had a huge thunderstorm asthma event, which sent 10,000 people to emergency departments, possibly because of pollen rupturing.
Yeah.
But it was completely dry. The humidity didn't increase until several hours after the storm. So can you comment on the sort of other, when you talked about NO2, but we're sort of at a loss to work out what caused.
Yeah, I know this events. I read, of course, about that, but they said that when there is a storm, the pollen from the plants usually, or sometimes they also include the fungal spores. They go to the clouds, and in the clouds where it's the very high humidity, the pollen break out, and then they release the content, and all this very tiny particles, they are with the cold air, they are going down. And then because usually the pollen are too big to go to our lungs, yeah, so we don't have an asthma allergy. But when the small micronic or submicronic particles are released, they can go to our lower respiratory system and cause asthma. And as I consider that this is the process that was described, that the release of smaller particles in the clouds going down very fast, and then we start breathing and we have asthma reaction. And yeah, it's in the Melbourne area. I heard that it's a very big problem right now. Even you have some forecast of this phenomenon. Yeah, probably only in the world, I guess.
Do we have more questions? One question particularly affecting the urban areas, I think, is that I read a while ago, I'm not sure how true that is today, that city planners apparently prefer to plant only male trees because they do not fruit, and then they don't incur large costs of cleaning underneath.
Yeah.
So would you comment on that? That seems to have some effect on the amount of pollen that's released.
Yeah, it's true, because because we don't have a lot of trees or plants that have male and females. Yeah, but some of them they're like, for example, how it's called. Okay, I forget, but it doesn't matter. Yeah, so when we favor the female, of course we plant the male, and only the male produce the pollen. So if there will be over planting of the male, we will increase the number of pollen in the air because there will be more. So from allergenic point of view, and there is some recommendation also to plant, for example, the female plants, because then we decrease the amount of pollen. Ginkgo biloba, for example, it's a one species that have this female and male, or willows also. Yeah, so there is some problems. Yeah, in one hand, the females are okay, the males are okay because they don't produce the fruits. But on the other hand, we should also think about the amount of pollen that could be allergenic, and in the case of some species, it could be. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, then let me just take maybe 1.5 minutes to quickly sum up.